Hey everyone, I never thought I'd be the type to share my personal life online, but I'm feeling stuck and need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone here can offer some advice or perspective. So, a little about me. My name's Jeff and I'm 32. Life hasn't been a straight line for me, but I've always been determined to make something of myself. Growing up, I didn't have much, so I learned to work hard early on. That mindset carried me through school and eventually into the business world. I'm proud to say I've made a decent career for myself, but it hasn't come without its challenges. That brings me to Elizabeth Miller. Elizabeth was the kind of girl who turned heads without even trying, beautiful, ambitious, and the type of person who always seemed to know where she was going. We first met in high school, but back then we were just acquaintances. She was part of the it crowd, always surrounded by people, while I was more of a quiet observer, focused on my grades and part-time job. Fast forward 10 years and we crossed paths again at a networking event. It felt like fate or something out of a movie. We started talking about the old days, and before I knew it, one conversation turned into another and another. Elizabeth had big dreams and I found myself drawn to her confidence. She came from a family that owned a manufacturing company, Miller Manufacturing. It was well known in our area and I'll admit I was impressed. But it wasn't just her family's success that caught my attention. Elizabeth had this magnetic energy that made you want to be around her. We started dating and things moved fast. At first it felt perfect. She was passionate, driven, and seemed to believe in me. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. She wasn't just gorgeous. She was smart, business savvy, and had connections that could open doors for me. We got married a year later, and I truly believed we were a power couple in the making. But as time went on, I started to notice cracks. Elizabeth could be self-centered, for lack of a better word. She loved the spotlight and thrived on praise. If things didn't revolve around her, she'd find a way to make them. At first, I brushed it off as part of her strong personality. I thought I could handle it, but it became harder to ignore. She always wanted the best: designer clothes, luxury trips, high-end everything. And while I wanted to give her the world, it felt like nothing was ever enough. Even so, I stayed. I loved her, or at least I thought I did. We built a life together, had 2 amazing kids, and I worked my tail off to make sure they had the stability I never did growing up. Still, something always felt off. Elizabeth had this way of making me feel like I was never quite good enough. If I did something for her, she'd find a way to criticize it, or worse, dismiss it entirely. I could have handled all that, but what came next blindsided me. I don't even know how to say it, but my life unraveled faster than I ever imagined. It started with small things, little lies and moments where Elizabeth seemed distant. At first, I thought it was just the stress of balancing her family legacy with our home life. But then one day I found out the truth. And that's where everything changed. Alright, picking up where I left off. I wish I could say there was some dramatic moment where I caught Elizabeth red-handed, but it wasn't like that. The truth came out in pieces, almost like a slow, cruel drip. It started with her phone. Elizabeth was always glued to it, scrolling Instagram, responding to emails, you name it. I didn't think much of it until I noticed how guarded she'd become. If I walked into the room, she'd quickly lock the screen or flip it over. One night, I was putting our kids to bed when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She was in the shower, so I thought I'd check to see if it was something urgent. The name on the screen caught my eye: Tommy. I didn't know a Tommy. It was an innocent enough message, something like, "Can't stop thinking about today." My stomach dropped. I wanted to believe it was a joke, maybe a wrong number, but deep down I knew better. Still, I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I started paying more attention, watching for patterns, noticing how she suddenly had a lot of work meetings and girls' nights. A few days later, I decided to look through her phone while she was asleep. I hated myself for doing it. I'd always trusted her, and snooping felt so wrong. But I had to know. What I found made me wish I'd never looked. There were texts, dozens of them, between her and Tommy, a guy from her gym. They weren't just flirty, they were explicit. They talked about meeting up, sneaking around, and how thrilling it was to keep me in the dark. I sat there, reading those messages, feeling like my heart was being ripped out of my chest. I wanted to wake her up and scream. Instead, I went downstairs, poured myself a drink, and stared at the wall until the sun came up. My mind was racing. How long had this been going on? Was this the only guy? Did she even care about me or our family? I felt like a fool, like the last person to know that my life was falling apart. When she came downstairs that morning, she acted like nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek, asked if I'd slept okay, and started making breakfast for the kids. I couldn't believe how normal she seemed, like she hadn't been sneaking around behind my back. That's when it hit me. Elizabeth was a professional at pretending. She'd been lying to me for who knows how long, and I'd been too blind to see it. I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to think, to plan. I didn't want to act out of anger and make things worse for my kids. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I'll never forget the night I finally confronted her. It was a Friday. The kids were at my parents' house for the weekend, and Elizabeth came home late from one of her so-called work meetings. I'd been sitting in the living room, waiting, with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. When she walked in, all smiles and carrying her designer handbag, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Where were you tonight?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She glanced at me, her smile faltering for just a second. "I told you, Jeff. I had a meeting with some suppliers." "Why?" "Funny," I said, standing up. "Because I checked the credit card statement. You were at that fancy restaurant downtown. Care to explain who you were meeting there?" Her face froze. For a split second I thought she might come clean, but then she started laughing, a forced, nervous laugh. "Oh, Jeff, come on. That was a networking dinner. You know how these things are. Stop being paranoid." Paranoid. That word lit a fire in me. I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshots I'd taken of her texts with Tommy. I held it up for her to see. "Does this look like networking to you?" The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth, then closed it like a fish out of water. Finally she muttered, "You went through my phone? How could you? That's such a violation of my privacy." Her privacy. She was turning this on me. I couldn't believe it. "Elizabeth, you've been cheating on me and you're worried about your privacy? Don't even try to flip this around." She sat down, putting her head in her hands. "Okay, fine," she said after a long pause. "Yes, I've been talking to Tommy. But it's not what you think. It's just flirting. I've been stressed with everything: work, the kids, the house. I needed an escape, but it didn't mean anything. I would never actually cheat on you." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Not what I think. Elizabeth, you've been meeting him, lying to me, sneaking around. Don't tell me it didn't mean anything." She started crying then, big dramatic sobs that felt more like a performance than genuine remorse. "I'm sorry, Jeff. I really am. I've just been feeling so unappreciated lately, like you don't see me anymore. I never meant to hurt you." Unappreciated. That hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd bent over backward for her, working long hours to provide for our family, giving her the lifestyle she wanted, making time for date nights even when I was exhausted. And now she was acting like I was the problem. I didn't know what to say, so I just walked out of the room. I needed space, time to process everything. But as I lay awake that night, I realized something. Elizabeth wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. After that confrontation, things between us were tense, to say the least. Elizabeth was walking on eggshells, suddenly trying to act like the perfect wife, cooking dinner, complimenting me, and making an effort with the kids. But it all felt hollow, like she was trying to cover up the mess instead of facing it. I couldn't let it go. The more I thought about her excuses, the less they made sense. Flirting? Stress relief? None of that explained the messages I saw, or the nights she came home late with no real explanation. I knew there was more to the story, and I was determined to find out. One night, after the kids were asleep, I brought it up again. "Elizabeth," I said, keeping my tone calm, "I need the truth. All of it. If there's any chance of fixing this, I need to know exactly what's been going on." She sighed dramatically, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Jeff, I already told you. It was stupid, harmless. I stopped talking to him after our argument." "You stopped?" I shot back. "Because last night I saw another text from him pop up on your phone. So are you going to keep lying to me, or are you finally going to be honest? Her face turned red, and she started fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. Okay, fine, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We met a couple of times, outside the gym. For coffee. That's it. Coffee. Sure. Elizabeth, I said, leaning forward, I already know about the restaurant. The messages weren't about coffee, were they? She hesitated, then finally blurted, all right. We went to dinner a couple of times. And yes, we kissed. But that's all. I swear. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me. You kissed? Elizabeth, do you realize how much damage you've done to our marriage? How could you do this? She started crying again, this time with a mixture of anger and desperation. I don't know, Jeff. I wasn't thinking. I guess I just wanted to feel, wanted. That word hit me like a slap. Wanted. I asked, my voice rising. Do you think I've spent the last 8 years of my life doing all of this because I didn't want you? I've given you everything, Elizabeth. Our kids. A home. Stability. What else could you possibly need? She didn't have an answer, just more tears and apologies. But I wasn't buying it anymore. The picture was starting to come together, and it wasn't pretty. The late nights, the constant need for validation, the way she dismissed my efforts as if they were never enough. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern. That night, I told her I needed space. I slept in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and wondering how my life had come to this. Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe it was just a kiss and nothing more. But another part of me knew better. Elizabeth was still hiding something. I could feel it. A few days after our conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more Elizabeth wasn't telling me. The way she stumbled through her explanations, how defensive she got when I pressed her, it just didn't add up. I needed clarity, so I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. At first, I felt ridiculous, like I was in some soap opera. But I didn't know who else to turn to. The investigator, a no-nonsense guy named Marcus, assured me he'd get to the bottom of things. If there's something to find, I'll find it, he said, his tone matter-of-fact. I didn't tell Elizabeth, of course. As far as she knew, I was still processing everything. For a week, I kept up appearances, pretending to focus on work while Marcus did his thing. Every time Elizabeth left the house, I felt a knot of anxiety in my chest. Was she meeting him? Lying to me again? The wait was agonizing, but when Marcus finally called, he had news. Jeff, I've got something you need to see, he said. My heart sank. He wouldn't call me in unless he'd found something significant. We met at his office, where he showed me photos and phone records. There were pictures of Elizabeth with Tommy, at the gym, at restaurants, even at a hotel parking lot. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Marcus explained that she wasn't just meeting him a couple of times. It had been going on for months. Then he dropped the bombshell. They weren't just having coffee or dinner. They'd spent the night together at least twice, according to hotel records and surveillance footage. I stared at the photos, my stomach churning. There was no more room for denial. Elizabeth had been lying to me from the start. I thanked Marcus, though the words felt hollow. As I drove home, I replayed everything Elizabeth had told me. The excuses, the crocodile tears, the half-truths. She'd looked me in the eye and sworn there was nothing physical, that it was just flirting and a mistake. And I'd wanted to believe her. I'd wanted to save our family, to hold on to the life we'd built. But now I knew the truth. When I got home, Elizabeth was in the kitchen, helping our daughter with her homework. She looked so normal, like nothing was wrong. I felt a surge of anger and grief as I stood there watching her. How could she betray me and still act like everything was fine? After the kids went to bed, I told her we needed to talk. She sat across from me at the dining table, her expression wary. What is it, Jeff? She asked, her voice cautious. I took a deep breath and said, I know about the hotel. About you and Tommy. So don't even try to deny it. Her face went pale. For a moment I thought she might faint. Then, she started shaking her head. Jeff, it's not what it looks like. Stop, I cut her off. No more lies, Elizabeth. I've seen the pictures. I've seen the proof. I know everything. She opened her mouth then closed it again, her eyes filling with tears. Finally she whispered, I'm sorry. Sorry. I said, my voice rising. You're sorry? Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just betray me, you've betrayed our family, our kids. And for what? Some fling with a guy from the gym. She started crying, but I couldn't feel any sympathy. Her tears felt meaningless now, just another act in this twisted drama she'd created. I want the truth, I said, my voice cold. All of it. Right now. And that's when she finally came clean. Elizabeth sat there, her hands trembling as she wiped at her tears. Okay, Jeff, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I'll tell you everything. She took a deep breath and started talking. It started a few months ago, she began. I wasn't looking for anything, I swear. Tommy was just there. He noticed me, complimented me, made me feel special. I know that's no excuse, but I felt invisible at home. Invisible. I interrupted, my voice sharp. Elizabeth, I've done everything for you, for us. How could you say that? She flinched but kept going. It wasn't about you. It was about me. I don't know why I let it happen, but one thing led to another. At first it was just texting and I told myself it was harmless. Then we started meeting for coffee and that turned into dinner, and then the hotel. I finished for her, my tone cold. How many times? She hesitated, and I could tell she was trying to gauge how much I already knew. Twice, she admitted. But it didn't mean anything, Jeff. I didn't love him. I was just stupid. I felt my jaw clench as I tried to stay calm. So you risked everything, our marriage, our family, for someone you didn't even care about? She nodded, her face crumpling as she started crying again. I know it was wrong. I hate myself for it. I'll do anything to fix this, Jeff. Please just give me a chance. Her words sounded desperate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling me the whole truth. Anything? I asked, my voice steady but firm. Then prove it. Show me everything, your phone, your emails, your social media. No more secrets. She froze, her eyes wide. Jeff, come on, don't you trust me enough? No, I said, cutting her off. I don't. Not anymore. So if you want to save this marriage, you'll have to earn it. Reluctantly, she handed over her phone. As I scrolled through her messages and emails, I saw more lies unraveling before me. There were conversations with Tommy that went back further than she'd admitted. Texts about how exciting it was to sneak around, how perfect their time together had been. And then there was something worse, messages to another man. They weren't as explicit, but they were flirty enough to make my stomach turn. She'd been lying about more than just Tommy. What about this? I asked, holding up the screen. Who's Ryan? Her face went pale again and she opened her mouth, but no words came out. Finally she whispered, he's just a friend. A friend, I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Does Tommy know about this friend? Or are you spreading the lies around evenly? She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. I don't know why I did any of it, she cried. I was selfish and stupid and now I've ruined everything. Please, Jeff, I'll do anything to make this right. But as I sat there listening to her, I realized I didn't believe her anymore. She'd lied too many times, hidden too much. And even now, her story felt like it was full of holes. I need time, I said finally, standing up. You've had your chance to come clean and you still couldn't be honest with me. I don't know if there's anything left to save. She begged me not to walk away, but I did. I went to the guest room again, shut the door and stared at the ceiling, wondering how much more of this I could take. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Elizabeth in the kitchen, talking to the kids like everything was fine. It hit me how easily she could compartmentalize, how she could betray me, lie to my face and then pretend to be the perfect mother. I couldn't stand to be in the same house with her anymore. After breakfast, I told her I needed some time alone. I packed a bag and headed to a hotel nearby. I told the kids it was for work, which broke my heart because they looked so confused. They didn't understand what was happening, and I wasn't ready to explain it yet. At the hotel, I sat down and tried to make sense of everything. My emotions were all over the place: anger, sadness, betrayal, and even guilt. Part of me kept wondering if I'd missed something, if there was a point where I could have done more to prevent this. But then I'd remember the texts, the hotel visits, and her lies, and the anger would come rushing back. While I was spiraling, Elizabeth started blowing up my phone. At first it was calls and texts apologizing, begging me to come home, saying we could fix this. Then the tone shifted. She started accusing me of overreacting, saying I was throwing away our marriage over a mistake. A mistake. She was still trying to downplay it. I ignored her, but later that evening my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I froze. It was Tommy. "Hey Jeff, I heard you found out about me and Elizabeth. I just want to say I'm sorry for how things turned out. It was never my intention to ruin your marriage. If you want to talk, I'm here." I stared at the message, my blood boiling. The nerve of this guy, reaching out to me like we were old friends. I wanted to call him and let him have it, but instead, I deleted the message and blocked his number. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much damage he'd done. The next day I got a call from Marcus, the private investigator. "Jeff, I thought you should know, I kept digging after our last conversation. There's something else you need to see." I didn't know if I could handle more, but I met with him anyway. He handed me a folder with more photos, more records. And there it was, proof that Elizabeth's affair with Tommy wasn't the first. She'd been involved with someone else a year before, a coworker. Marcus explained that the coworker had been transferred to another branch after things fizzled out, but the pattern was clear. Elizabeth wasn't just having a moment of weakness with Tommy. This was who she was. Driving home, I felt a strange sense of calm, like a weight had been lifted. For weeks I'd been blaming myself, questioning what I could have done differently. But now I knew the truth. This wasn't about me. It was about her and the choices she kept making. When I got back, Elizabeth was waiting for me in the living room. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her makeup smudged, her hair messy. "Jeff," she said, standing up as I walked in. "I'm glad you're home. Can we talk?" "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "We need to talk." I didn't waste any time. The minute I walked through that door, I knew it was the moment. I couldn't keep dragging this out. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to tolerate any more lies. I stood there for a second, just looking at her. Elizabeth, the woman I'd married, the woman I'd trusted with everything. And yet, here we were on the verge of ending everything. She tried to smile, but it was forced, like she was trying to make it seem like we could just pretend everything was okay. "Jeff," she said, her voice shaky, "I know things have been crazy. But we can fix this. Please, let's work through it together." I could hear the desperation in her voice, but it wasn't enough. "No, Elizabeth," I said, my tone even, but there was a coldness to it now that I couldn't hide. "We're not going to work through this. You've had more than enough chances." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "Jeff, I cut her off. You've lied to me. You've cheated. And I'm done being the fool. You think I'm just going to forget about the hotel, about the other guy? You think I'm going to just act like nothing happened?" She looked like she might crumble at that moment, her face pale, her lip trembling. But she didn't get a chance to speak again. I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I hired a private investigator, Elizabeth. I know everything. The texts, the lies, the other affair you had a year ago. You're not fooling me anymore. You've been living in a fantasy and I've been living in it with you. But not anymore." Her face turned ghostly. "You hired a what?" Her voice was trembling now, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape. "Yeah," I said, my words cutting through the tension in the room. "I've seen the pictures. I've seen everything. Don't try to deny it." She collapsed onto the couch, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry, Jeff. I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for it to get this far. It was just a mistake. Please, you have to believe me." I didn't feel sorry for her anymore. I didn't even want to. A mistake? Elizabeth, this wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. And you've been making it over and over again. I'm not here to make excuses for you, and I'm not going to pretend this isn't who you are. You've shown me exactly who you are. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. And now I'm done. I'm done with the lies, done with the betrayal. I want a divorce. Her face crumpled. She started crying, but it wasn't like the tears from before. This time, it felt like she was truly realizing that she'd lost everything. No, Jeff. Please don't do this, she begged, her voice breaking. I swear I'll do anything. I'll change. Just don't leave me. Don't take everything from me. But I had already made my decision. It's too late for that, I said, my voice steady. You've already taken everything from me. And now I'm taking back what's mine. I turned to walk out, but then I stopped. I had one more thing to say. I've spent my whole life building something solid. And I'm not going to let you tear it apart. I'll make sure you get what you're entitled to, but nothing more. I'm taking control of my life again. I'm doing this for me. For our kids. I saw her looking at me, broken, desperate. But I couldn't feel sorry for her anymore. I was done. I walked out of that house and it felt like I was leaving behind a life I thought I wanted. But in truth, I was just walking away from the lie. Walking out of the house felt like stepping into a storm, but for the first time in weeks I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't second-guessing myself anymore. I knew what I had to do, for me, for the kids, and for my future. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. I explained everything from the affairs to the lies and asked about my options. He was blunt but helpful. Jeff, it's good that you're coming to me now, he said. We'll need to move quickly. You're in a better position than you think, especially with the postnuptial agreement. The postnup. That was the one smart move I'd made in our marriage. Elizabeth had agreed to sign it a few years ago when we'd hit a rough patch financially. At the time, she saw it as a formality, a way to protect our family in case things ever went south. I never thought I'd actually need it, but now it was my safety net. Under the terms of the agreement, Elizabeth wouldn't be entitled to the company I'd worked so hard to build or any assets tied to it. She'd get a reasonable settlement and child support, but nothing that would let her keep up the extravagant lifestyle she was used to. That postnup was my way of ensuring that, no matter what, my kids would be taken care of, and that Elizabeth couldn't bleed me dry. With my lawyer handling the legal side, I started focusing on what mattered most: my kids. They didn't know the details, and I wasn't going to burden them with the mess Elizabeth had created. I just told them that Mom and Dad were going to live apart for a while, but we both loved them very much. They seemed confused and a little scared, but I promised them that everything would be okay. That promise wasn't just for them, it was for me too. I had to believe it. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was doing everything she could to get back in my good graces. She called, texted, and even showed up at my office unannounced. Every time it was the same routine: apologies, tears, promises to change. At first I let her talk. I wanted to see if she had anything new to say, anything that might make me reconsider. But it was all the same. She wanted forgiveness, but she didn't seem to fully understand what she'd done, or why I couldn't just let it go. The final straw came when I found out she'd been talking to Tommy again. I got a call from one of her friends, a mutual acquaintance, who'd heard through the grapevine that Tommy had reached out to her and she'd responded. When I confronted Elizabeth, she denied it at first, but then she admitted it. He just wanted to apologize, she said, her voice trembling. I told him it was over. That's all. I shook my head, feeling a wave of disgust. You're still choosing him, I said. Every time you let him back into your life, you're choosing him over me, over our kids, over everything we've built. She tried to backtrack, but I was done listening. That night, I told her I was moving forward with the divorce. No more discussions, no more second chances. It was time to put an end to this. Once I made my decision to proceed with the divorce, things moved quickly. My lawyer filed the paperwork, and I moved into a small rental house a few miles away to give myself space. It wasn't much, but it felt like mine, a place where I could finally breathe without Elizabeth's lies suffocating me. Elizabeth's reaction was predictable. At first, she begged me to reconsider, claiming she'd do anything to fix our marriage. When that didn't work, she turned spiteful. Suddenly, everything was my fault. She said I was cold, distant, too focused on work, and that I'd driven her into Tommy's arms. It was like she was rewriting history to make herself the victim. The hardest part was how the divorce impacted our kids. Our daughter, who's 9, started asking a lot of questions. "Why don't you live here anymore, Dad? Did you and Mom have a fight?" I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to burden her with the truth. I just told her that sometimes adults have problems they can't fix, and that it was better for everyone if we lived apart. My son, who's only 6, didn't say much, but I could tell he was struggling. He'd cling to me every time I picked him up or dropped him off, like he was afraid I'd disappear. It broke my heart. No matter how much I tried to reassure him, I could see the confusion and fear in his eyes. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was struggling to adjust. The post-nup meant she couldn't touch my business or the majority of my assets, and reality was starting to hit her hard. She couldn't keep up her designer lifestyle, and she wasn't happy about it. She tried to manipulate me, calling it odd hours, claiming she didn't have enough money for groceries or the kids' school expenses. But I'd already set up a separate account for child support, and I knew she was just trying to guilt-trip me. One day I dropped the kids off at her place and she cornered me in the driveway. "Jeff," she said, her voice shaking, "please don't do this. Don't throw everything away." I sighed, keeping my tone calm. "Elizabeth, this isn't me throwing anything away. You did that. I'm just making sure I can still stand when the dust settles." She started crying again, but I didn't stay to watch. I couldn't. Every interaction with her felt like a tug of war between anger and pity, and I didn't want to lose sight of why I was doing this. But then came the real kicker. A few days later I got a call from my lawyer. "Jeff," he said, "Elizabeth's attorney filed a request to contest the post-nup." My stomach dropped. "On what grounds?" I asked. "Duress," he replied. "She's claiming you pressured her into signing it and that it's invalid." I couldn't believe it. She had signed that agreement willingly, and now she was trying to claim otherwise. "What are my options?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "Well," he said, "the burden of proof is on her. If we can show that she signed it voluntarily, we should be fine. But this could get messy." Messy didn't even begin to describe it. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth escalated her tactics. She started badmouthing me to mutual friends, accusing me of being controlling and unfaithful. It was laughable considering everything she'd done, but it still hurt. Some people believed her, or at least pretended to, and I started to feel like the villain in my own story. The fight over the post-nup became the centerpiece of the divorce. Elizabeth doubled down on her claim that I'd pressured her into signing it. She told her lawyer, and anyone who would listen, that I'd used our financial troubles as leverage to force her hand. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same woman who'd happily reaped the benefits of that agreement for years, and now she was playing the victim. My lawyer wasn't worried. "Jeff, don't let this rattle you," he said during one of our meetings. "We've got documentation, witnesses, and plenty of evidence to show she signed it voluntarily. It's just a scare tactic." Still, the whole process was exhausting. Every court filing, every new accusation from her side, felt like another jab in a fight I didn't want to be in. Elizabeth's lawyers were trying to paint her as a wronged spouse, struggling to survive while I supposedly hoarded wealth. They even claimed I was using the post-nup to punish her for the affairs. But the truth was on my side. My lawyer presented emails from back when we drafted the agreement, showing that Elizabeth had reviewed it with her own attorney, and signed it without hesitation. There were no threats, no pressure, just her agreeing to terms she now wanted to ignore. As the case dragged on, Elizabeth's behavior became more erratic. She started showing up late for custody exchanges, looking disheveled and distracted. Once, when I picked up the kids, they told me she'd been on the phone with someone named Ryan, yes, the same friend from her texts, while they were trying to get her attention. It felt like history was repeating itself. The kids were my biggest priority through all of this. I tried to shield them from the chaos, but it wasn't easy. My daughter, ever perceptive, started asking tougher questions. "Why does Mom say you're trying to take everything from her?" she asked one night as I tucked her into bed. I paused, trying to find the right words. "Sweetheart, sometimes adults don't agree on things and it can get complicated. But I promise you, I'm not taking anything away from Mom. I'm just trying to make sure everything is fair." It was the best I could do without dragging her into the mess. The turning point came during a court hearing. Elizabeth took the stand, tears streaming down her face as she described how I'd manipulated her into signing the post-nup. She claimed I'd threatened to leave her if she didn't agree, that I'd used our financial struggles to scare her into submission. But then my lawyer brought out the emails, texts, and even a signed statement from the attorney who'd advised her at the time. The story Elizabeth was spinning unraveled in real time, and the judge didn't look impressed. When the ruling came down, it was a relief. The post-nup was upheld, and Elizabeth's attempts to contest it were dismissed. She was furious, of course, and she didn't hide it. After the hearing, she cornered me outside the courthouse. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her face red with anger. "This isn't over, Jeff. I'll make sure you regret this." I just looked at her, tired of the games. "I don't want to fight with you, Elizabeth," I said. "But I'm not going to let you walk all over me anymore." She stormed off, leaving me standing there, more determined than ever to protect what mattered: my kids, my business, and my peace of mind. After the court ruling upheld the post-nup, I thought things might settle down, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of accepting the outcome, Elizabeth seemed to spiral. It was like she couldn't handle the idea of losing control, not just over me but over the life she'd grown so comfortable in. Her desperation showed in everything she did. She started calling and texting me at all hours, alternating between begging for forgiveness and lashing out. One minute she'd be promising to change, saying she'd go to therapy, do anything to fix us. The next she'd be accusing me of tearing the family apart, blaming me for her affairs, and even threatening to tell the kids her side of the story. It was exhausting. I started keeping a log of every interaction we had, just in case things escalated further. My lawyer advised me to limit contact as much as possible and only communicate through email or text about the kids. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Then came the day Elizabeth crossed a line I never thought she'd cross. It was a Friday, and I was supposed to pick up the kids after school for the weekend. When I got to their school, they weren't there. The teacher told me Elizabeth had already picked them up earlier in the afternoon. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. Panic started to set in as I drove to her house, only to find it dark and empty. I called my lawyer immediately, and he advised me to stay calm and document everything. "It could be nothing," he said, trying to reassure me. "But if she's withholding the kids, we'll handle it." For hours I tried to reach her, texting and calling, but there was no response. Finally, just as I was about to call the police, she texted me back. "The kids are fine. They're with me. I needed some time with them, that's all." That wasn't how custody worked, and she knew it. I texted back, demanding she return the kids immediately. Her response was chilling: "They're my kids too, Jeff. You don't own them. Maybe they're better off with me full-time." I didn't sleep that night, and by morning, I was at the courthouse filing an emergency motion. My lawyer assured me we had a strong case. The post-nup, combined with her erratic behavior and her decision to withhold the kids, painted a clear picture of someone who was losing control. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and in the meantime, Elizabeth finally returned the kids. They were fine, thankfully, but I could tell they were confused and upset. My daughter said, "Mom was crying a lot and said you don't want us anymore. Is that true?" It took everything in me not to lose it. I hugged her tightly and said, "That's not true at all. I love you both more than anything. No matter what, I'll always be here for you." The hearing came quickly, and Elizabeth didn't hold back. She cried on the stand, claiming she was just protecting the kids and that I was trying to alienate her. But my lawyer laid out the facts: her erratic communication, her disregard for the custody schedule, and even text messages showing she'd admitted to taking the kids out of spite. The judge didn't buy her excuses. Not only did I retain my custody rights, but Elizabeth was ordered to stick strictly to the parenting plan. Any deviation would result in legal consequences. The look on her face as the ruling was read was a mix of anger and defeat, but I couldn't feel sorry for her anymore. She'd brought this on herself. After the court ruled in my favor, I thought Elizabeth might finally back off, but instead her behavior became more erratic. It was as if every boundary the court set only fueled her resentment. The kids started picking up on the tension, especially my daughter. She'd come back from weekends with Elizabeth asking questions like, "Why do you hate Mom?" Or, "Did you make her cry again?" Elizabeth was clearly trying to manipulate them, painting herself as the victim and me as the villain. It was infuriating, but I knew I couldn't stoop to her level. I made a promise to myself that I'd never badmouth her in front of the kids, no matter how much it hurt. One night, my daughter mentioned something that stopped me cold. "Mom said she might have to sell the house," she said quietly. "She said you're making her do it." Elizabeth's financial situation was catching up to her. The court's decision meant she couldn't rely on me to fund her lifestyle anymore, and the reality was hitting hard. She wasn't working full-time, and the child support I provided was meant for the kids, not luxury handbags or spa days. The next day I got a call from her. Her tone was icy. "I hope you're happy, Jeff," she said. "You've taken everything from me. Now I have to uproot the kids because you couldn't compromise." I held my ground. "Elizabeth, this isn't about me taking anything. You made choices and now you're facing the consequences. The kids will always have a home with me no matter what." That only seemed to enrage her more. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? Well, we'll see how long you can keep it together." I hung up, not wanting to escalate further, but her words stayed with me. I was holding it together, for the kids, for my business, for my own sanity, but it was taking its toll. The stress, the constant battles, and the weight of being both parents during my custody weeks were overwhelming. Then came the incident that shook everything. A few weeks later I got a call from my son's school. They said Elizabeth had picked him up unexpectedly, claiming there was a family emergency. When I called her to find out what was going on, she didn't answer. My stomach dropped. This was starting to feel like the custody stunt all over again. But then she called me back, sounding frantic. "Jeff, he's fine," she said, her voice shaky. "He just had a little accident at the park and I wanted to get him checked out." I demanded to know why she hadn't called me first, and her excuse was flimsy. "It all happened so fast," she said. "I didn't have time to think." When I finally saw my son later that day, he seemed fine, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I talked to him gently, asking what had happened, and he told me Mom was really upset. She was yelling on the phone before we left the park. It was clear her emotions were spiraling, and now they were starting to affect the kids in ways I couldn't ignore. Elizabeth's instability hit a breaking point not long after the incident at the park. The cracks in her facade were becoming impossible to ignore, and it wasn't just me who noticed. Her friends and even her own family started reaching out, worried about her behavior. One night her sister called me. We'd never been particularly close, so it surprised me to see her number pop up on my phone. "Jeff," she said without preamble, "I don't know what's going on with Elizabeth, but she's not herself. She's been shutting everyone out, acting erratic. I think she needs help." I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Part of me wanted to say, this is what happens when you burn every bridge you have. But another part of me couldn't shake the memory of the woman I'd once loved, the woman who was now unraveling before everyone's eyes. Her sister's concerns were validated a few days later when Elizabeth showed up at my house unannounced. It was a Saturday afternoon and the kids were inside playing. I opened the door to find her standing there, disheveled, her eyes red like she'd been crying for hours. "Elizabeth," I said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pushed past me into the house, her movements frantic. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't keep doing this, Jeff. I can't lose everything." I followed her into the living room, keeping my distance. "Elizabeth, if you want to talk, we can do that. But you can't just show up like this." She spun around, tears streaming down her face. "Do you think I'm a bad mother? Is that what you want? For everyone to think I'm a failure?" Her outburst caught me off guard. "This isn't about what I want," I said, trying to stay calm. "It's about what's best for the kids. And right now they need stability." She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. "I've ruined everything, haven't I?" She whispered. "You're right, I'm selfish. I'm awful. But I don't know how to fix it." Seeing her like that, a broken shell of the confident, ambitious woman I'd once known, stirred something in me. Not love, but a sense of pity and regret. Despite everything she'd done, I didn't want her to self-destruct. For the sake of the kids, if nothing else, I needed her to find her footing. "Elizabeth," I said softly, sitting down across from her, "you need help. Real help. Therapy, counseling, something to deal with everything you're going through. For yourself and for the kids." She nodded slowly, wiping her face. "I'll do it," she said. "If it means I can still be in their lives, I'll do whatever it takes." I wasn't sure if she meant it, but it was the first time she'd shown any real accountability. We talked for a while longer and I set clear boundaries, no more showing up unannounced, no more involving the kids in adult issues. She agreed, though I could tell it hurt her pride. Before she left, she said something that stuck with me. "You're a good dad, Jeff. Better than I ever gave you credit for." It wasn't much, but it felt like a small step towards something better, or at least less destructive. In the weeks following Elizabeth's breakdown, things finally began to stabilize. She followed through on her promise to seek therapy, attending sessions twice a week. Her sister later told me it had been a wake-up call for her, that she realized how far she'd fallen and how much damage she'd caused. For the first time in years, Elizabeth started taking responsibility for her actions. She even apologized to the kids for some of her behavior, though she didn't go into specifics. It was a step forward, but I wasn't holding my breath for a complete transformation. Our co-parenting dynamic improved slowly. We started communicating strictly through a parenting app, which helped keep conversations focused and civil. It wasn't perfect, there were still tense moments and disagreements, but it was better than the chaos of the past few months. Meanwhile, I was focusing on rebuilding my life. I poured myself into my work, finding renewed purpose in the business I'd worked so hard to build. My relationship with the kids also deepened in ways I hadn't expected. I was more present with them, more patient and more grateful for every moment we spent together. They were my anchor, my reason for pushing forward. One day, my daughter handed me a drawing she'd made at school. It was a picture of the three of us, her brother and me, standing in front of my house, smiling. Above it, she'd written, "My family." It hit me like a ton of bricks. Despite everything, they still saw me as their constant, their safe place. That meant everything to me. As for Elizabeth, she was still adjusting to her new reality. She sold the house and moved into a smaller place closer to her sister, who had become her biggest support system. From what I heard, she was trying to rebuild her life too, focusing on the kids during her custody time, staying in therapy, and cutting ties with people like Tommy. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the person she used to be, but I'd accepted that we could never go back to what we had. Too much had happened and too many wounds had been inflicted. Still, I wanted her to succeed, not for her sake but for the kids. They deserved to have a stable mom, even if she wasn't the wife I'd thought she was. The divorce was finalized a few months later. Sitting in that courtroom, hearing the judge declare our marriage officially over, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and a quiet sense of closure. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was mine now, and I was determined to make the most of it. A year later, I can say I'm in a much better place. I've rebuilt my life on my terms, focusing on my kids, my career, and my own well-being. The anger and resentment I once felt toward Elizabeth have mostly faded, replaced by a kind of cautious indifference. We co-parent as best we can, and while we'll never be friends, we've found a way to coexist for the sake of the kids. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far I've come. The betrayal, the lies, the chaos, it all felt insurmountable at the time. But here I am, standing on the other side of it. Stronger, wiser, and ready to keep moving forward. To anyone reading this who's going through something similar, I'll say this: it's not easy. There were days when I didn't think I'd make it through. But you're stronger than you think, and there's a life waiting for you on the other side of the pain. You just have to take that first step.